All right, let's dive into something that isn't talked about nearly enough: what ADHD really looks like in our romantic relationships. We're going to move past the usual stuff about work or school and get into the much more personal side of things. We all have a pretty standard idea of ADHD, right? Distraction, maybe bouncing off the walls. But what if that's just scratching the surface? What happens when the unique wiring of an ADHD brain starts to quietly shape who we're attracted to, how we connect, and what intimacy feels like?
Because way beyond those stereotypes, there's this whole hidden dynamic playing out. It's a world of emotional ups and downs and behavioral patterns that can feel, honestly, just baffling and maybe even hurtful for both people in the relationship if they don't get what's really going on under the hood.
So, to figure this out, we have to go right to the source. It all starts inside the brain with a tiny little chemical that's basically the choreographer for a very specific and very important dance. Let's get into the science of it. Okay, so the main character in this whole story is dopamine. You've probably heard of it. It's often called the feel-good chemical. And that's pretty accurate. It's what drives our motivation, our sense of pleasure, and that little reward signal in your brain that says, hey, that was awesome, let's do that again.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, and this slide shows it perfectly. A neurotypical brain, well, it has a pretty steady, regulated dopamine system. But the ADHD brain, it works a little differently. It often has a lower baseline level of dopamine, which means it's constantly on the hunt for things that give it a bigger jolt of stimulation, just to feel normal, focused, and engaged. And I love this quote because it just nails it. The ADHD brain isn't broken or flawed, it's just wired for a different purpose. Think of it as a system built to chase what's new, what's exciting, what's stimulating, all in the name of getting that next crucial dopamine reward.
So you might be wondering, how does this constant search for dopamine actually show up in a relationship? Well, it can create this really powerful pendulum effect, especially with intimacy and desire. It can swing from one extreme all the way to the other. So on one end of that pendulum, you can have hypersexuality. This is that dopamine-seeking system kicked into high gear, a really intense craving for the novelty and the rush that comes with new sexual experiences. But then that pendulum can swing to the complete opposite side, hyposexuality, where desire just shuts down. And this isn't about a lack of love. It's often the brain's way of protecting itself from being overwhelmed, stressed out, or even just bored. And here's the absolute key. These two states look like total opposites, but they come from the exact same source, that unique dopamine system. The highs, the intense desire, are fueled by novelty and excitement. The lows, the shutdown, are often triggered when the system is either overloaded by stress or, on the other hand, starved of stimulation by routine that offers no dopamine reward. Now, this whole pendulum thing doesn't just affect sexuality. It actually shapes the entire journey of a new relationship, creating what you could really only call a romance roller coaster. Does this sound familiar at all? Have you ever been in a relationship or known someone who was, where it started out like a movie, just this unbelievable, intense whirlwind, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, that fire just fizzles out, and everyone's left wondering what happened? Well, this dopamine dance gives us a pretty clear answer. It often follows this pattern called a hyperfocus romance. First, the sheer novelty of a new person creates this massive dopamine flood. That triggers a state of hyperfocus, where the ADHD brain just locks on to that new partner with incredible passion. But, eventually the relationship settles down, it becomes more routine, and that novelty starts to fade. The dopamine levels drop, and the brain, looking for its next fix, can start to pull back emotionally, which is so confusing for the other partner who's wondering what on earth they did wrong. And this right here is probably the most important takeaway. The person with ADHD hasn't necessarily fallen out of love. Their brain has fallen out of the supercharged chemical state that was fueled by all that initial novelty. It's a neurological shift, not an emotional rejection.
So when we start putting all these pieces together, you've got the dopamine chase, the intimacy pendulum, and this hyper-focus roller coaster, we can finally see a clear, understandable pattern emerge from what might have just looked like chaos. So let's just quickly recap the big points here. First, a lot of these confusing relationship dynamics, they're driven directly by the way the ADHD brain manages dopamine. Second, those behaviors that seem like polar opposites, being super intense versus totally withdrawn, they actually spring from the same root cause. Third, that romance roller coaster isn't random, it's a predictable cycle. And maybe most importantly, understanding why this is happening is so much more helpful than just judging what is happening.
And I want to be really clear, none of this is about excusing behavior that might be hurtful. It's about explaining it. This knowledge gives us a new lens to look through, a framework that can help turn confusion and hurt feelings into real communication, and hopefully, empathy for both people involved.
And that kind of brings us to our final thought here. Once you see this underlying dopamine dance, it's really hard to unsee it. It makes you ask some bigger questions, doesn't it? About what we expect from love, how we really define connection, and how we can build relationships that are stronger and more compassionate in a world where our brains don't all work the same way. It's a pretty powerful shift in perspective. Thanks for joining us for The Explainer.